Today we are going to be talking about bullying, cheating, anti-feminism, and a little bit of naked tennis from the woman who brought us fairy tales, family values, and the faraway tree. We are going to be diving deep into the dark history of Enid Blyton, one of the most prolific and beloved children's authors of all time, to discuss how nothing is quite as it seems on the surface when it comes to these public figures and influencers and creatives and the people we know and love and celebrities and all of that stuff. And with all that in mind, can we ever separate the art from the artist? So as I said, Enid Blyton is one of the world's most famous and prolific children's authors. I would think that most people of my age or older, almost definitely, like if you're in England, probably if you're in some European countries as well, maybe America, I'm not sure, but definitely English people my age and older, we grew up reading her books over and over and over again, and some of them are just thoroughly lovely. On the other hand, some of her books are probably a little more questionable these days, thanks to them being the product of a pretty messed up time, if we're being honest, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But on the whole, she wrote really wholesome books about adventure and fairies and wishes and tea and cakes and mummy making picnics while daddy goes off to work and so on. My personal favourites are always the Faraway Tree books. I love them so much. It's about this tree that these three children climb, and it has all these like magical people inside, and at the top of the tree there's a ladder that takes you to all these like faraway places and different magical lands and stuff, and you know, it's always shifting and you don't know where you're going to end up, but you know it's going to be somewhere exciting and magical. And so it was always a bit uncertain, and it was kind of messing with my anxiety as a kid, and I was always scared that I was going to end up the faraway tree and lost and away from home, but then would that really be a bad thing? I didn't know. Either way, they were still my favourite books, and I read them over and over and over and over. But as well as her fantasy books about pixies and goblins and elves and so on, she also wrote plenty of stories and books with like moral lessons for kids. And one I distinctly remember was this one about this girl who finds like a pack of sweets on the way to school, and she eats one and she hands them out to all her friends, and they all become ill, and they learn that they're not sweets at all, but they're tablets, like pills, medicine, and they all become ill, and there's like a whole moral lesson in it of like, don't eat things you find on the street, which I think is a good lesson we can all learn, or something. Blyton's books are so well known at this point that she has been in the Guinness World Records book like a whole bunch of times for being like one of the world's best-selling authors and for writing more books than almost any other writer, with over 700 books in her life. And that's not including all her poems and articles and God knows what else. Like, she was writing constantly. So I think a lot of us are very familiar with Blyton's work and her books, but maybe not quite so much with her personal life, because when I first started to kind of look into this and find out about it a few years ago, I was genuinely shocked. And today I want to tell you the story of Enid Blyton, the person, and kind of the questions that her life raises and some of the discussion points we can have about this and what we can learn from her as a human being, albeit a very flawed human being. Enid was born in 1897 in South London, although her parents were originally from Sheffield, like me. So I do feel this sort of connection with her. You know, I lived in South London for a while, I'm from Sheffield. You know, there's a thing there, apparently, in my mind. Growing up, she was super close with her dad, and he would always tell her stories and read her poetry and encourage her to garden and play piano and of course to read, and it all sounds really lovely. She clearly had a really nice relationship with him, they clearly cared about each other a lot. It sounds really great. However, it wasn't all perfect. As a kid, she used to witness her parents fighting a lot. They would argue all the time. Her mum was super traditional and just wanted to stay home with the kids, and she really wanted Enid to do this as well. She wanted Enid to become the traditional housewife like her, which is really interesting when you hear about some of Enid's values and kind of what she preached to people later on, but that's towards the end of this video. Thing is, as a kid, Enid had absolutely no interest in this, and she just wanted to spend her time reading and learning like her father. That said, like with all the chaos going on, Enid and her brother would often like sneak out of their rooms at night and listen to their parents arguing and fighting, which is how, when she was around 12 years old, Enid found out her dad was having an affair, and this shocked her. He was like this perfect figure in her life before then, and afterwards, no. So he left the family when Enid was 13, and he went on to have 3 more children with this new woman that he was having the affair with, that he married. And he and Enid were just never as close after this. They just didn't have the same relationship at all. What's really, really interesting as well is that while all this was going on and her parents were getting divorced and everything like this, Enid never actually told anyone about this stuff. Not friends, not anyone at school, no one. She was being sent to this posh private school at the time where her dad would sometimes come and visit her and bring her expensive presents. And she was really, really kind of like cut up about this. She was really sad. But she never told anyone, she never let it show. She just let everyone think everything was fine and normal, and this was just her regular dad coming and bringing presents because he loved her, not because he was guilty about leaving the family, you know? All this time, her dad was trying to force her into a career in music, specifically playing the piano, and her mother kind of went along with it, but Enid, even though she was very, very talented, didn't want to do that. She just wanted to write, and she wanted to teach as well, which is exactly what she ended up doing. However, this caused a lot of talk amongst her mother's friends, who thought she must be hiding something, and so her mother tried to cover it up. She's like, oh no daughter of mine's becoming a teacher. It's very odd. And it led to this huge fallout between Enid and her mother, where they just stopped talking, and her mother didn't really know where she was in the end. She didn't know where she was doing her teacher training or where she was living or anything like that. They just stopped talking. At 21 though, Enid Blyton got exactly what she wanted, and she got her first teaching job. She was an absolutely fantastic teacher. She was really creative, she was enthusiastic, and after a few years of just kind of teaching normally and reading to kids and whatever, she started to write her own stories for them and read them to the kids, and the kids loved them so much. She was like an immediate success with the kids in her classes. In 1923, so she was 25, 26 at this point, I think, she met a man called Hugh Pollock, who was working for a publishing firm which Enid had started submitting her own stories to. And this is where her life starts to get really, really surprising, because Hugh and Enid start a relationship, and the way this is written about in Enid Blyton's biography, which if you want to find out which one I'm referencing a lot of this from, it's linked and referenced down in the video description, it just sets off so many red flags for me. So Hugh is described in this biography as a handsome, fair-haired man with striking blue eyes. He was in his middle 30s. With his glamorous background, air of quiet authority and sophisticated manner, he charmed the 26-year-old, emotionally very immature Enid from the start, while her childlike naivety and zest for life drew the war-weary ex-soldier to her from their first meeting. Do you see some of the issues I have with this? So they began to spend time together, and there's this entry from Enid's diary. She was, oh my god, she was obsessed with writing diaries. She would write in her diary almost every day. She recorded so much of what happened, but later on, like towards the end of her life, she destroyed a crap ton of her diaries, so we only have like certain bits and bobs left now. We don't quite know everything from her perspective, which is something, again, we'll come back to later. So in her diary at the time, she wrote, met Hugh at 2. Went to the zoo and looked round. Taxied to Piccadilly restaurant and had tea and talked till 6. He was very nice. We're going to try and be real friends and not fall in love. Not yet, at any rate. We're going to meet again tomorrow. And this is then followed by a lot of entries about Enid chasing him and him seeming to be kind of like hot one minute, cold the next. And their relationship just kind of seemed toxic as hell from the beginning, I'll be honest. So her biography recounts that they met for dinner or for visits to the newly opened Wembley exhibition, the cinema or the theatre, and at times quarrelled vehemently. Hugh was obviously exceedingly jealous, and on one occasion the mention of a casual acquaintance of Enid's was enough to set the pair off on an argument which lasted for days, though he eventually made it up with a small present. There were also a bunch of complications with Hugh already technically being married the whole time. Apparently his wife had left him for someone else a few years earlier during the war, but he was still married to her, and this caused a bunch of drama. Also probably explains his jealousy and insecurity and those issues as well. All this said, Enid was clearly infatuated with the man. She was obsessed with him, and she wrote about him in her diary like an excited schoolgirl with her first crush. And I guess technically he probably was her first kind of big important crush. So I don't know, again, also she's 26, so that said, they did eventually get married, and their relationship became a little bit more functional at this point and slightly less toxic, at least for a little while. So Enid wrote about arguments and stuff in her diary, but it was kind of funny, regular stuff like, quarrelled with Hugh as he thinks I ought to like his mother and I can't. I went into the spare room after another quarrel, but Hugh fetched me back. So slightly dramatic, but not too, I guess, out of the ordinary for some couples, I guess. Other good things were like Hugh really supported Enid and her work, both in public and private, which is really great. He encouraged her to write, he pushed her writing, he helped it get published. One big problem they did have though was around Enid's fertility. So in 1928, a gynecologist diagnosed Enid as having an underdeveloped uterus. Apparently that was a technical term at the time. Don't know if it still is. But apparently, and I quote, it was almost that of a young girl of 12 or 13, which meant she couldn't naturally conceive. So she started on hormone treatments, and finally in 1930 she fell pregnant and had a daughter, Gillian. Over this period though, after her kid was born and while she was pregnant, she started to get more and more isolated from people, including her husband. Both of them were working a lot more and they didn't have as much time for each other. And then once Gillian was born, Enid was just exhausted all of the time, and honestly like a little bit bored by some aspects of motherhood, which, yeah, I understand, it doesn't appeal to me either, I get it. So in the end she hired someone to come and help, and she much preferred like putting her energy into her work while someone else did the repetitive stuff that she found boring, like feeding and changing the baby. She was like, yeah, I'll read to my kid, I'll play with my kid occasionally, I'll take it on walks, but I don't want to actually look after it. I'll pay someone to do that. Take of that what you will. But again, please bear that in mind when we discuss some of her preaching about family values later. The thing is though, it wasn't just Enid who was having problems. Hugh himself was quite a troubled man, and by mid-1933 he was seriously struggling. He was drinking heavily, he was clearly depressed, he was often sad and silent with everyone. Some suspect he was suffering from PTSD after the First World War. And throughout all this, Enid didn't really seem to care. She wasn't all that interested in his mental health problems or his drinking or his struggles. She basically just ignored them until she couldn't anymore. It's kind of the opposite of what he needed in his wife and his partner. At the time, they had a bunch of staff working for them in their home. So we're talking like gardeners, cooks, nannies, and they all began to notice that Hugh was unwell. So once Enid kind of couldn't ignore it anymore, they began to take these family trips away and like short holidays to see if that would make him better. And sometimes he did get better for a little while, and then he'd slip back into the heavy drinking and the depression and the anxiety again. After one particular trip to Scotland with his mother, Enid wrote in her diary that so she went to meet Hugh from the train station on the way back, and apparently Hugh drove home from the station and we nearly had several accidents, indicating that he was either still drunk, behaving recklessly, or just not able to fully concentrate on driving safely, all of which are a huge problem. That said, his mood seemed to lift for a little while over a longer period of time when Enid fell pregnant again, until she sadly miscarried. And his mood slipped back again, it was a whole thing, until she got pregnant again the next year, and their second child, Imogen, was born in October. So again, he was happy for a little while during the pregnancy and straight after the birth, but that happiness didn't last very long. After Imogen's birth, the family hired a nurse, because again, Enid didn't really want to do the stuff like feeding the baby and all the basic stuff. So they hired Dorothy, who became a really close friend of Enid's, and this ended up putting even more strain on the marriage for a number of reasons. Without having to like look after her kids full time by herself, Enid could concentrate more on her writing, and she became more and more successful all the time. She was pumping out more and more books and stories and poetry and writing newsletters for magazines and all sorts of things, and she was making a lot of money. She was really successful. But at the same time, Enid began to feel that she could no longer kind of rely on Hugh. She couldn't trust him, especially with his drinking and his depression and everything. And she stopped asking him for help or guidance, and instead just completely pulled away from him, just withdrew, was very independent, but not necessarily in a healthy way. Her diaries at the time suggest that she somehow saw him as being weak for showing his vulnerabilities, as she called them, by which she means his mental health issues, which is obviously a really awful view to have, and especially as someone you're supposed to love. And this is why even today, reducing the stigma around mental health issues, especially men's mental health issues, is so important. And understanding that you can't just ignore these problems, you need to help and support the people you care about and love who are struggling and suffering. It's so important. yeah, so Enid kind of did the worst thing she could for Hugh, basically. Plus, like I said, during this time, Enid became really, really close friends with Dorothy. And Hugh resented this. He thought Enid was depending too much on Dorothy and not on him, which was true. That's exactly what she was doing. And he became really insecure and really jealous, and Enid did absolutely nothing to make him feel better. She just ignored him and his worries and his concerns and his issues. And there are, in fact, plenty of people who actually believe that Enid and Dorothy were having an affair at this time. And there is some evidence to suggest this, but we can't say for certain. We can't be like, yes, they absolutely did, but it's a possibility. And so, unsurprisingly, with all this going on, Hugh became even more depressed and started to drink even more. Their house at the time had this like small hidden cellar sort of thing, and Hugh would retreat in there and he would go and drink alone in secret, and the only person who knew about it was their sort of gardener slash handyman slash sometimes driver. This guy called Dick Hughes, he was the only one who knew what was going on, and he would go into this little like cellar and clear up after Hugh and, you know, remove all the empty bottles and stuff like that of things he'd been drinking. Except one day he couldn't cover it up anymore because Hugh, in the summer of 1938, he collapsed in his cellar and he was found in there, and his secret hidden drinking spot was suddenly revealed to everyone in the household, and everyone suddenly knew, damn, okay, this drinking problem's bad, it's worse than we thought, he needs some actual help. It wasn't just the alcohol that was making Hugh ill though, and that's not the only reason he collapsed. He actually had really, really bad pneumonia at the time, and he was taken to the local hospital. And Enid really struggled to deal with kind of illnesses and hospitals, and she had this huge phobia around it all. And everyone thought Hugh was going to die, including Enid. His family was called to come say like their last goodbyes and everything, and they really thought he was a goner. And then he made this miraculous recovery, and everyone was just completely relieved. And nearly losing Hugh, but not quite, sort of scared Enid enough to realise that she didn't want to lose him, and she sort of fell back in love with him all over again, you know, and it kind of rekindled their marriage a little bit. What's really, really interesting about this whole time period, though, is that although all this kind of chaos and misery were happening in the background, Enid never made it public, which is kind of understandable, but also kind of odd when you consider what she was making public. So at the time, she was writing this regular column for a magazine called Teacher's World, where she described her life in this really wholesome fairy tale manner. She gave so many mundane details about her life and told stories of this and this. I did this with the dogs and this with the kids and blah, blah, blah. One of her biographies describes some of her writing during this time when he was ill and in hospital and an alcoholic and struggling. Apparently, she went on to tell of how she had listened to her doves cooing to each other, her dogs and cats and other pets waking, and as breakfast time approached, two little voices that meant Gillian and Imogen were also awake. It's lovely, she wrote, to see the world looking so fresh and new. Meanwhile, her husband was ill, depressed, and an alcoholic, in hospital fighting for his life. The other thing that I find a little bit interesting is that in a lot of her writing, she'd often refer to her husband purely as Gillian's daddy, rather than by his name. So it really is kind of like reading one of her books, but about her real life. It's like she had this like degree of separation from it, and it kind of feels like she was one of the original bloggers, you know? Writing and posting about a very edited, narrow view into her world on a regular basis. And it's very, very interesting, and something that we definitely see parallel today on social media, on blogs, on Instagram, on YouTube, everywhere online basically. And this wasn't the only kind of like influencer type thing that she did. So around the same time, Hugh, Enid, and the kids were in the process of moving house. And again, there was drama here because Hugh didn't really like it, but Enid kind of bulldozed her way into getting it, which you may be noticing was kind of a pattern for her. A lot of people say she was a bit of a bully. Like literally years after her death, so many people that Enid knew, so like her staff, extended family, friends, all ended up describing her as a bully and a bit of a control freak and having sort of like anger issues and things, which is quite sad really, but not the point of this part of the story. The point is, Enid Blyton had a habit of naming her houses, something cutesy like you kind of find in her books, and while she named the first couple herself, she eventually began to ask her child fans to name her houses for her, or in some cases name her pets, like give suggestions and she'd pick one. And she did this too with her newest and ultimately last home. And in one of her blog-style columns, if we want to call them that, she wrote of her new home that it was a very happy-looking house with its roof of deep red-brown tiles, many casement windows and tall chimneys. Gillian was to have a small bedroom to herself, and on her recent birthday had been given presents towards its furnishing. There was as yet no pond, but the new garden had 2 rockeries, an orchard, and a large vegetable garden that seemed to grow prize vegetables. Gillian and Imogen were to have one of the hidden lawns for themselves, their own secret place with their garden, swing, and sandpit. Side note, can I live here? Because I want a sandpit, swing, and rockeries, please. I will happily live here. And as one of the biographies of her life states, Enid's request for names for this new home met with an enthusiastic response. Hundreds of children wrote to her in the weeks that followed, and she quoted their suggestions in her columns. Eventually, she revealed to them that although she thought sunny corners, red roofs, tall chimneys, and cherry trees, and many others were all charming, one in particular, green hedges, had appeared more frequently than any other. And so that's what she named her house. And she went on to publish some absolutely adorable poetry about it. So there was this whole poem, but here's just one little stanza for you that's, I think, quite cute. I think we shall love you, little new house, with your big trees all around, and your quaint green hedges and secret bowers, and hidden lawns and glowing flowers, your daisies all over the ground. Meanwhile, her husband's nearly dying, but adorable, right? However, despite putting on this everything so lovely and perfect type front, things weren't really going to plan even after Hugh recovered. After Hugh's recovery, the first winter in Green Hedges, the entire family caught influenza and became really, really ill, and they were all struggling, and this, once again, developed into pneumonia for Hugh. And at this time, he was really, really struggling with major anxiety issues, mostly over global politics this time, and Enid just dismissed them and ignored them, as she always had. And I'm sure that those of us who suffer with anxiety and have anxiety problems can tell you that is the worst thing a person can do when you're having these worries, is just dismiss them and tell them you're being stupid and ignore them. It's, oh god, it's the least helpful thing. And then all of Hugh's anxieties and worries came true, and World War II happened. And this was the beginning of the end for Hugh and Enid. And I think we'll all agree Enid was pretty horrible in this entire situation, as you'll see in a moment. So bear in mind, during the last war, Hugh had to go away with the army, and his first wife had cheated on him and left him for this other man. And then based on what he saw during the war itself, he suffered really bad PTSD for years afterwards. So you can see why he's really anxious going into this one. That and, the fact it's war. That's a terrifying thing, especially to be a part of. Hugh eventually had to work with the Home Guard, and that meant being away from the family home a lot, and Enid was not happy about this. She kind of only thought of herself during this time, and she often pleaded with him to stay with her, but people shouting outside, but obviously he couldn't. Guys, please don't be drunk. It's not even that late. It's 8:30, you shouldn't be this drunk at this time. I thoroughly dislike Leeds and drunk people. God, last night, New Year's Eve, sorry, side note here, absolute nightmare. People were pulling up plants in the garden, people were throwing bottles of Prosecco off the balconies, there's been broken glass everywhere today. Walking Kyra has been an absolute nightmare. I've been so worried about her paws. It's just, never live in Leeds. I am very ready to move. Sorry, where were we? So Enid was pleading with Hugh to stay home with her, and he's it's the war. I have a job to do. I can't. So she ended up feeling really rejected and unhappy and lonely, which isn't really surprising, and you can't blame her for it, but you can blame her for how she responded to this and how she reacted. So on top of her husband being away all the time, her kids were now both in school, and she no longer employed Dorothy, her best friend / potential mistress, because the kids were older. And because the war was on and Dorothy was a nurse and her skills and expertise were needed elsewhere, she had crap ton of work on in other places, and this meant she had very little time for Enid anymore, and so Enid began to get very, very lonely, and her eye began to wander a little, and by a little I mean a lot. So her biography describes this as, there were still several unattached men living in the neighbourhood, and it pleased her that one or two in particular appeared to seek out her company. Although she was used by this time to a certain amount of adulation over her work, it was a boost to her morale with Hugh away to have members of the opposite sex paying court to her, and she did not discourage their attentions. Basically, Enid had a lot of affairs. She was just basically at it the whole time Hugh was away with like a whole bunch of people. It's, yeah, whole thing. However, Hugh wasn't actually completely innocent himself either. In the summer of 1940, he met Ida Crowe, a novelist 19 years younger than him, and they began to spend a lot of time together, going to dinners, working together, the theatre, basically dates. They were dating, and it's not certain, but the evidence suggests that it wasn't a sexual relationship at this point, but it did seem like an emotional affair. There was clearly romantic interest between them. By Christmas, Hugh returns home and things just kind of implode. He finds out about Enid's affairs from some of the staff at Green Hedges, and Enid apparently, and this sounds suspicious to me, but you know, we only have her word for it, Enid apparently received an anonymous telephone call warning her about Ida and how close she was with Hugh. So they argued a hell of a lot, and Hugh leaves, he goes back to work, and he goes back to Ida, and he tells her that it's not been a good leave. They were his words, it was not a good leave. And Enid went off and found herself another man to sleep with. And I thoroughly understand Hugh's upset at being cheated on, especially when this is how his last marriage ended. Like, twice he's had to leave for war, and twice his wives have cheated on him. But it's also difficult to see him as completely the victim in this because of his relationship with Ida, which started before he even knew about Enid's affairs. And sure, it might not have been a sexual relationship, but it was clearly a romantic one, you know? I guess it leads us to the kind of morally ambiguous question of, is it worse that Enid had a few casual partners to distract her from feeling lonely, or worse that Hugh had one single partner that he had feelings for? What's the bigger betrayal? The physical affair or the emotional affair? Or rather, numerous physical affairs or one emotional affair? It's hard to say. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. But then again, we also have to consider that, like, Enid's behaviour towards Hugh, even before he left, and her lack of understanding around his mental health problems, we have to understand how that would have hurt him. But then again, Enid was also hurt, and she felt alienated and alone, so it's a difficult one where I don't think there's one good guy and one bad guy. I think, like many things we've heard about this relationship so far, it's all just a big toxic grey area, you know? Things did take a huge turn in 1941 though, when Enid stopped having multiple affairs and just had the one single affair instead. It was actually Dorothy that introduced them. So there's this really interesting passage from Enid's biography which reads, Dorothy had arrived at Green Hedges to find, to her dismay, that her friend appeared to have become deeply involved with a rather dubious and unscrupulous character, more interested in Enid's money and position than in the woman herself. To get her away from what she felt to be an impossible and dangerous situation, and hoping that a change of scene might bring Enid to her senses, Dorothy suggested that they should both take a few days' holiday with her sister Betty at Budleigh Salterton in Devon. And it's there that Enid met married Dr. Kenneth Darrell Waters and immediately just fell for him. She was like head over heels crazy about him. It was clearly mostly just like an attraction thing at first. And actually, this is something that I find really, really interesting, right? Because Enid Blyton was all about sex. She clearly loved it. She could not keep it in her pants. She was, you know, having so many affairs. And like, one of her favourite hobbies was literally playing tennis naked with a bunch of other middle-class people. So she clearly, you know, was pretty sexually open, and she was okay with that. It's one of the things that first attracted her to Hugh, was they had great chemistry, and same with Kenneth here. But what's so jarring is when you consider her very, like, overtly sexual nature with this one psychologist's analysis of her. So Michael Woods, the psychologist, wrote of Enid Blyton that she was a child. She thought as a child and she wrote as a child. And on top of this, one of her biographers added that certainly her emotional immaturity was very evident throughout her adult life, particularly in her relationships with others, but that she never left her childhood entirely behind might well explain her ability to produce the kind of writing to which children of all ages and nationalities seem to relate. She did, of course, possess extraordinary creative and imaginative gifts, an amazing capacity for hard work, and a shrewd business acumen, but she was also able to look with a child's eyes at the stories she was creating and to project herself into them with such enthusiasm that her young readers very quickly became caught up in her excitement as they avidly devoured each page. So while this explains her wild, amazing creativity, maybe her lack of impulse control, and her stroppiness at times, it's quite interesting that she was also an extremely sexual adult, childlike in nature, but incredibly sexual. I don't know what this means. I'm not even gonna pretend I could attempt to psychoanalyze this in whatever way. I think it's something worth noting that's kind of interesting and makes you go, Anyway, Edith? Where's Edith? Do I keep calling her Edith? I hope not. Anyway, Enid and Kenneth were just immediately obsessed with each other, and even after that first holiday when they met, they continued to meet up with each other. Kenneth would go over to Green Hedges whenever Hugh was away, and when Hugh was home, Enid actually rented out a flat in London, in Dorothy's name, of all things, so she's getting her involved, where she would go and meet up with Kenneth and they'd just have lots of sex in this flat. So this was a fully planned and thought out affair. This wasn't a spur of the moment thing. Throughout all this though, Hugh kept coming home. Both of them were saying, we want to make this work, we're going to try and make this work. But at the same time, Hugh's still dating Ida, and I think it's become way more serious at this point, so take of that what you will. But eventually Hugh finds out about Kenneth and he begins to file for divorce. And I guess this is kind of like the whole crux of the video. This whole story of her cheating with multiple partners and stuff is what kind of was one of the main prompts for me wanting to make this, because this whole story to me is so odd. On the surface you have Enid Blyton, who seems like such a wholesome, lovely woman, but turns out under the surface she's a serial cheater who seemed to have no compassion for her husband's feelings or mental health problems, and she didn't really seem to care all that much about him once she'd found a new partner, someone to replace him within her affections. And I know I should kind of hear all this and be completely like disgusted by her and her behaviour, but in some ways I understand why she did some of it, because I understand her feelings of like loneliness and isolation. And now don't get me wrong, as I've said before in multiple videos, like understanding something doesn't mean I agree with something. I can say, yeah, I understand where they're coming from, but that doesn't mean I agree with their conclusion or their actions or anything like that. It doesn't excuse anything she did, but I do think it explains it. And I mean, for both of them to seek out other people, albeit in different ways, there must have been something fundamentally flawed in their relationship. And so, while we could sit here and say they're a bad person or they're a bad person, blah, 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 I think ultimately I just kind of feel pity for both of them, you know? Or at least I would if that was the worst thing Enid did, but it was not. Not by far. Oh God. This gets worse. So although Hugh originally was the one to file for divorce, Enid decided, because she now knew about Ida, she did not like this. She did not want Hugh filing for divorce against her on the grounds of adultery. So she made a counter-proposal. She would be the one to file for divorce on the grounds of adultery, and in return they had this verbal agreement to split completely amicably, stay friends afterwards. Hugh would be able to see his daughters whenever they liked, and Hugh's like, mate, this is really fair. Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. This sounds wonderful. And so the divorce goes ahead. During this time, Kenneth is also discreetly divorcing his wife and keeping Enid out of everything, not implicating her at all. Everything's kept very quiet. It's all done very amicably. It's kept out of the papers, probably because of how they handled it, but also because, you know, there are more important things going on in the world, like war. So they all get divorced. Divorces all around. Divorces for everyone, you know? It's all like, you get a divorce and you get the idea. Just a few months after all the divorces are granted, Enid and Kenneth remarry, and less than a week later, Hugh and Ida get married as well, so that's fun. Literally 6 days apart. The really, really messed up thing though is they kind of really messed their kids around during this whole divorce and breakup process and everything. So the girls didn't really know about the breakup or the divorce for a long time. At one point, Hugh went away to go work in America, and Gillian, the eldest daughter, who he was like closest to, she was really upset with him going, and she said she had a premonition that she would never see him again, and this sadly proved to be the case. So after this point of him leaving to work in America, it was a whole year later, so just days before Enid and Kenneth got married, that the girls actually found out their parents were splitting up and divorced, and that, oh look, Enid's getting married again, and suddenly they just had to accept Uncle Kenneth as their new dad instead. It was, I don't know, a little bit messed up how they handled it all with the kids. It was or rather how Enid handled it all, because she didn't let Hugh see them during this time to discuss anything. It was all Enid. And the most awful part about all this is that this amicable divorce agreement between Hugh and Enid, straight after the weddings, she just threw it out the window and crapped all over it, and then burnt it for good measure. She just continually refused to allow Hugh to see his children for the rest of his life, for honestly no good reason. I mean, like, maybe we could kind of say that she was, like, somehow mimicking what happened in her own childhood after her father remarried or something by feeling generous, but that still doesn't make it okay. Again, it may offer a potential part of an explanation, but that doesn't excuse it. That doesn't make it acceptable. Keeping a man who wanted to be a father away from his children who loved him is not a nice thing to do at all, and in my mind, that's inexcusable. And it does sound in general like Enid did not have the best relationship with her kids at all. So when they were younger, she used to write all the time about, like, reading to them and walking in the garden with them. But then as the kids got older, it became apparent that they didn't really have the easiest of relationships at all, and they probably weren't all that close. So apparently Enid treated Gillian, the eldest, as her favourite, and so Imogen, the youngest daughter, described her mother as being distant and unkind towards her. And when she was way, way older, so in her 70s, Imogen actually gave an interview about this and said that her mother was arrogant, insecure, and without a trace of maternal instinct. Her approach to life was childlike, and she could be spiteful like a teenager. And that's not all of it either. So Hugh and Ida apparently went on to have a daughter called Rosemary, who also accused Enid of a bunch of awful things. So she said that Enid Blyton purposely ruined Hugh's literary career after the divorce, and that because of her, Hugh had to file for bankruptcy because he couldn't find work anymore. Enid apparently spread all kinds of awful stories about Hugh amongst everyone in the industry, everyone they knew, just the public in general, and Rosemary is quoted as saying, Enid was capable of many vindictive things, which is all pretty damning, isn't it? Like, it feels like no one in her life really thought she was all that nice a person, which is, I don't know, crazy to me. It's insane. That said, Enid and Kenneth were married now. She changed the kids' names to have the same surname as Kenneth, and that's a whole thing. And the first year of marriage was a little bit difficult for both of them. So Enid was so used to having her independence at this point, and Kenneth was so used to being in charge of everything that at first they clashed like crazy and they argued a lot. Their solution to this, as written in Enid's biography, was honestly not the healthiest sounding one. It's, again, makes you go, When Enid eventually realised that her husband could be as stubborn as herself, she's found a better way of overcoming his obstinacy than trying to counteract it with harsh words. By using all her feminine wiles and coaxing, she was soon able to manipulate any situation her way, all while letting him believe that he still retained the upper hand. Doesn't sound healthy, does it? But regardless, they still appeared to be relatively happy. They did support each other, they were proud of each other's work and achievements, and in the spring of 1945, Enid discovered she was pregnant again. Yay! They were incredibly happy about this, and it helped smooth over like a lot of issues they had at the time. But sadly, 5 months into pregnancy, Enid miscarried. They were both really disappointed, very sad, and that was Enid's last pregnancy. After her miscarriage, Enid was never pregnant again, and she started to just throw herself into her work even more than ever. She'd always written a lot, but now she was pushing herself even harder than ever, and Kenneth was genuinely worried about her overexerting herself. Because burnout is a thing. It's always been a problem, it's still a problem, and it's something I think people don't take as seriously as they should. It's a real issue. One of the big problems was that Enid was very particular about how and when she worked. She'd be very demanding, she hated interruptions, and if she was interrupted at all, she'd get really angry, really snappy. And this caused some issues with Kenneth, but the biggest problem was with Dorothy, her best friend, and the woman some say she was having the affair with. This caused a huge problem with them, a huge falling out. So their friendship was already suffering a little bit at this point, because people report that Dorothy had been upset by Enid's divorce and remarriage to the point where she hadn't even attended the wedding. She refused to go. Now, was this because she hated divorce on some religious or moral grounds? Was this because she preferred Hugh to Kenneth? Or was this because she was jealous of her lover marrying someone else? We don't know. I know in general it's kind of, you wouldn't want to speculate on someone's sexuality, but the amount of evidence that's there, I think it's a fair thing to question. So like I say, there are all these theories flying around, and there's evidence that's just this or this or this or whatever, but we don't know for certain. We absolutely cannot know. But the point is, Dorothy was already upset by Enid's remarriage, and what we do know is that just before her death, Enid made sure to destroy almost all of her diaries from around this time and just before. So there was very little, or at least there was a lot missing of her and Dorothy's relationship in these diaries. There was a lot from around this time that was missing, and we don't quite know everything about this falling out because Enid decided all her diaries need to be burnt. Whatever she was hiding, it's very intriguing. But despite being strained, they were still friends, and in 1944, absolute disaster struck, and Dorothy and her family became homeless thanks to their home in London being bombed. They lost everything, they really, really needed help. And Enid over the phone was like, yes, oh my god, come stay with us, this is fine, I got your back, I'm your friend, this is what friends do. Probably not in those words, but you know. I can't really imagine Enid Blyton saying, I got your back. Oh yes, I got your back. And not the point. Anyway, Green Hedges was more than big enough for this family of 5 to go join them. It's gonna be fine, all good, except it wasn't. Having 5 new people in the house disturbed Enid and her routine and her work, and she ended up getting really, really nasty with Dorothy and her family. Reports say that Enid made their life so unpleasant that within 2 days they decided to pack their bags and leave. Enid made absolutely no apology for her behaviour, and Dorothy, who'd never actually sought her help before, she was just like, I cannot forgive you. Absolutely cannot forgive you. She was like, this is my big time of need, I needed you, you're supposed to be my friend. Not even an apology. So yeah, that's nice. I mean, like, you hear stories, right, of like geniuses and artists being rude and unkind to people, especially when they're like in the middle of working, which Enid always was. But how much rude behaviour can we really tolerate from a genius before their work just isn't worth it anymore? You know, does creating work that will be remembered and loved for generations and help millions of children really come before a close friend and her family being in need? But then again, how much of our personal lives should we sacrifice for our work and our art? On the other hand, how do we know when and how much to sacrifice our art for those we love? Tough questions, and they're ones that we still absolutely face today. And I think a lot of people today try to play this card of like, but I'm an artist, so I can treat people however I want, or like, oh, it doesn't matter that I did that, I did it for my art. But I just don't think that holds up. I don't think that's fair, and that's something I will never be able to understand or support. I mean, I think we can all be snippy at times, I think we can all be emotional, we can all be frustrated, and we can all react really, really badly under pressure. That's a very, very human thing, and while it's not ideal, it's normal and it's understandable. But the problem is when this happens repeatedly, and you don't feel bad about it, and you don't try and make amends for it. That's when it's a problem. Being under pressure at work and getting a bit snappy with someone you care about happens. But it's when you don't apologise for that, it's when you don't make up for it, it's when that happens over and over and over and over again that it becomes a kind of unforgivable problem, you know? And I can understand why Dorothy was so mad at Enid for this, and I can understand why they didn't end up speaking for 10 years after this. I'm on Dorothy's side. I'm Team Dorothy here, you know? But all this horrible behaviour aside, you know, horrible to her staff, her children, her husbands, her friends, all that aside, it was during this period that Enid began to do most of her charity work and make an even bigger positive impact on the lives of children than ever before. Enid Blyton did a hell of a lot of good in her life. She started her own magazine in 1953, and then she also set up a series of clubs which children could join. Through these, she encouraged kids to help other people or animals, to help children with illnesses or disabilities. She donated a lot of money to various charities because of them. I think one figure quoted was around £35,000, which was a crazy amount back then. I looked up at inflation changes, and someone said that's between £850,000 and £900,000 in today's money, which is a lot of money to raise and give to charity. That's an excellent thing that cannot be overlooked. Her work, it's said, would urge her readers to be kind and love one another, and she often told kids that, and again I quote, kindness of heart means you cannot possibly do or say anything that would hurt anyone or upset them. All lovely, important sentiments that apparently Enid wasn't really practicing in her day-to-day life, which, the hypocrisy, I know. But this is one of those complicated things, isn't it? For all the bad things Enid did, she also did a hell of a lot of good ones, and you can't really overlook them. But This isn't to say all her work was completely positive. It absolutely wasn't. She also had some really, really harmful beliefs that she spent a lot of time preaching about, as I've alluded to a lot in this video. So a lot of the stuff she spoke out about and I guess campaigned for, you could call it, is exactly the kind of stuff that I actively call out today in my videos and my content. So for example, in 1949, she publicly criticised the fact that during the war, the government were encouraging women, specifically married women in particular, to work in factories and take on other jobs like that. She said this would mean abandoning children to the care of others, which is kind of hilarious considering that's exactly what she did, with how much help she had from nannies and nurses and so on in raising her own kids. Regardless, she continued to preach traditional family values by talking about how kids needed a secure home background and that the mother needed to be the one to provide this. She even used her own family as an example in a 1952 article when she wrote, like I say, of her family and her kids and everything. "We all have a sense of humour. We are all, thank goodness, good-tempered. Nobody sulks, nobody complains, nobody is unkind. But that, of course, is largely a matter of upbringing. Spoilt children are selfish, complaining and often conceited. But whose fault is that? It is the mother, always the mother, that makes the home. The father does his share, he holds the reins too, but it is the mother who makes a happy, contented home. She is the centre of it. She should always be there to welcome the children home, to see them and listen to them. I was lucky to have a gift that could be used at home. I could not have left my husband or children and gone out into the world to make my career. All true mothers will know what I mean when I say that." Which is just a lot, isn't it? I think there's probably some resentment here towards her own. Oh, well, maybe not though, because her mum was really into these traditional values as well and being a stay-at-home mum, so I don't know, but maybe there's still some resentment there. Considering what her children said about her later in life, maybe she was just being a bit of a hypocrite. I don't know, but it's very, very interesting, isn't it? And this is kind of a pattern that we see, again, a lot today. There are parallels with modern culture as well. So, like, a lot of the fundamentalist families, like the Duggars that I do talk about on my channel and sometimes cover in my videos, the parents have very similar views to this, and especially in terms of thinking that, like, their way of bringing up kids is the only way, and they've definitely done it perfectly, and so their kids are faultless, and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's just not the case. No one's a perfect parent. No kids are perfect. That's not how the world works. And that's okay. Other moral issues that she liked to speak and write about included how apparently every child needs to be brought up with religious teachings to provide a moral backbone. And she also went on about how American-type comics and basically any content made for kids which had any violence in it was the absolute worst thing ever and destroying children and blah blah blah, and she was really, like, avidly against it. Which again is funny considering the fact that some of her stories, which, while not violent, were definitely scary in places. Like, there's this one of Noddy being lured into a dark, dark forest just so he can be mugged. And you see them, like, ripping his clothes off and taking all his stuff. And, like, I still have nightmares about that today. It is terrifying. Although, there's another controversy in that story, which we will cover in literally, like, 2 minutes, so gimme time. But while we're on the topic of these, like, moral issues, I find it so interesting that she was so outspoken about these and adamant to tell people what's right and what's wrong, while she wasn't the most moral person herself behind the scenes. And my initial response to this was to scream hypocrite. But then again, maybe she is just human. Like, she's allowed to have one type of view about, for example, the content that kids consume, and another about cheating in marriages. Just because they don't both, like, align with my view, that doesn't necessarily make her a hypocrite. I struggle a little bit more with, like, her views about women and what they should and shouldn't be doing in regards to work and family, especially considering how insensitive she was to her first husband's addiction and mental health problem stuff. I do find that still makes me want to shout hypocrite, but I don't know. I think it's a difficult one and it's a complicated one. And again, we're in this grey area. I do think this is just, like, a really interesting point though, because I think there are plenty of times, even today, and again, it's about drawing these parallels between, like, her life and our lives today, but I think there are plenty of times today when we just expect people to be good people or bad people, and the reality is, it's just not that simple. Like, people aren't just good or bad, but we do good things, and we do bad things, and we do good things that have bad consequences, and bad things that have good consequences, and mediocre things, and everywhere in this grey zone. And I see people talking about, God, I don't know, celebrities or scientists or any online creator. I see people talking about me as well, and they're all like, they'll point to maybe, like, one thing that they've seen, that's only usually one-sided things. And I see people talking and they make these really definitive statements like, oh, Rachel is a good person, or Rachel is an awful person. And like, as nice as it is to hear the first thing and as upsetting as it is to hear the latter, I don't think either one is true. Like, I'm a person who tries their best to do good things, and sometimes I slip up and I do bad things. And I think that's a very normal human thing to do, and a very normal human kind of person to be. I know I sound like an alien when I call myself a human person, but I'm not, I promise. There's a point I'm trying to make here. I think myself as a creator and Enid Blyton, like anyone else, like, I don't think she's just a bad person, and I don't necessarily think she's a good person either. I think maybe she wasn't saying this stuff because she was a hypocrite. I think maybe she was saying it because she really believed it, and maybe this is the kind of person she wanted to be. And she thought if she preached about it, if she told it to others, then maybe it would become a reality for herself as well. And I mean, really, what would we prefer? If she like got up to a big crowd of people, or she was writing in a magazine for millions of people saying like, yeah, I repeatedly cheated on my husband and you should too. Like, of course not. So I think in some cases, while we might be able to call it hypocrisy, I don't necessarily think it's inexcusable. And like I say, I don't necessarily think it makes her a bad person. I do, however, think there are some kinds of hypocrisy which are completely inexcusable, like in the case of the Duggars, for example. And I've spoken about this in a couple of videos, especially the situation around Josh Duggar. And basically, like, if you don't know, I'll link them in the video description as well. But like, content warning here, this is a horrible case that talks about issues of child abuse. But the Duggars were on TV and in public and on their blogs and everywhere, talking about what a perfect, modest Christian family they were. And Jim Bob, who was kind of like the father of everyone, the head of the household, was running this political campaign on the platform that, in his words, all people who rape and commit incest should face the death penalty. While at the exact same time, he was actively covering up for the fact that his eldest son, Josh, molested a number of his incredibly young siblings, sisters in particular. That's a level of hypocrisy I can never, ever, ever excuse or understand. And I don't think it's really comparable to Enid Blyton saying we should all be good mothers and then not being the best mother. I think one of those is kind of understandable levels of hypocrisy, and one of them is unforgivable levels of hypocrisy. Do you know what I mean? That's not to say that one person doing something bad negates another person doing something bad, not at all. I just think sometimes perspective matters. It's a complicated one, isn't it? It's so complicated. I think what I'm trying to say is that, like with Enid Blyton, I can hear her viewpoints and decide to disagree with them. I can look at her harmful actions and decide they were bad, and at the same time I can still read her books and enjoy them and understand that she did a hell of a lot of good in her life too. I don't think one negates the other in this particular case. I don't think, like, the fact that maybe some of her books were a little insensitive in places negates the fact that she raised nearly like £1 million to help all children in today's money. But I also don't think the fact that she did so much charity work means that we can ignore the problematic things either. And that's actually something I want to talk about right now, like the problematic content in her book, because it's not flawless by any means. And that's not surprising, is it, when you consider the amount of books she put out? It was something like 700 books, wasn't it? Short stories, poems, articles on top of that. She published a lot over the years. Like, I have no idea how many words that is, but I'm gonna guess it's in the millions. And it is really difficult when you have such a vast amount of work out there to judge these kinds of things. And again, it's kind of the same with YouTubers. We're under so much pressure to put out so much content all the time. So when someone makes a judgment about me, for example, based on like only one video they've seen, it's frustrating, because like if someone says something like, I make a video on one topic and you're like, oh God, I can't believe you didn't mention X, Y, or Z. You must be awful or stupid or this or this or this. I'm like, well, I can point to 10 other videos where I did that thing that you said I didn't do. It's just, I didn't mention it in this case because I figured I already had before. It's things like that, and it's very, very frustrating. But at the same time, it can be, we can have the opposite problem in some cases. Sometimes we miss harmful things that people do because the sheer volume of content that's out there. And that's how I think so many people get away with bad things for so long. You see stories of these YouTubers who hurt their pets and abuse their pets or mistreat their kids, or who are taking advantage of fans or underage fans in particular and stuff like that. And people are like, well, how did we miss this before? And sometimes it's because if there's only like a subtle clue in, 1 minute of a video when they have hundreds or maybe even thousands of hours of content out there, it's because it's hard to see. And this, I guess, is kind of the thing with Enid Blyton. She puts so much content out there that, like, what percentage has to be bad before we can damn it all? Is there a percentage? Or can we say, no, these stories are fantastic and these are really bad? Can we kind of separate that? It's a difficult topic to discuss, and I don't think there's any solid answers here, but I think it's important that we do discuss them. So let's talk about what these problems are. So let's talk about what some of these criticisms actually were. Some people critiqued Blyton's main characters for, and I quote, too often displaying petty, spiteful, vindictive, even cruel behaviours towards their adversaries, who were often of a different nationality or social background to her predominantly middle-class English heroes or heroines. Others argued that her work was too simplistic or not challenging enough or just generally too bland. And Enid was not happy about any of this. She did not like facing criticism, which is kind of understandable. It's difficult to hear, but I don't think her reaction was very well. She came out publicly and claimed that her critics were just jealous of her success or her as a person, or they were just too stupid to really understand her books for themselves. She called her critics stupid. Like I say, I found this particularly interesting because it mirrors the behaviour of a certain someone whose poetry I criticised a couple of years back as not being very good. And it's very interesting to see them both behaving in a very, very similar manner in this respect. I think it's absolutely fair to be upset when receiving criticism, but I think there's a right and wrong way to respond to it, and learning to respond in the right way is something that does take time and effort, and it's a part of being a creator or an artist or putting any work out there. It's something you have to learn along with any other skill. I think when you receive criticism, it is an absolutely fair response to say something like, okay, I hear your criticism, but remember it's still enjoyed by the target audience. And I also think it's a fair rebuttal for any of the critics to come back to that and say, yeah, but that still doesn't make it objectively good. One example being, for example, 50 Shades of Grey. Huge hit at the time with its intended audience and very, very popular. Made a lot of money, sold a lot of copies. But it's still, from a critical perspective, an objectively bad piece of writing and a terrible, harmful representation of BDSM that deserves criticism. So that's just one example. However, I don't think it's ever okay for, like, a creator's response to criticism to be, yeah, you're just too dumb to get it, and resort to insulting your critics. Enid did that, and that's not okay. A certain YouTuber did that, and that's not okay. I see fans of, for example, Jordan Peterson doing that, and that's not okay. I've seen, I think it's Tamimi recently has been facing a lot of backlash from H3's fans because she criticised Ethan for something and they all came back with just insults and stuff, and it's not okay at all. I think it's a ridiculous comeback and it doesn't hold up at all. So like I say, I do have a lot of dislike for how Enid Blyton handled and addressed her critics. But that said, receiving criticism is hard and it's understandable to be upset by it. And as I say, I think learning to overcome criticism and address it in a productive manner is a really important skill that is worth everyone developing. And it's not easy. It's something that I've always struggled with, and it's something that I continually try and work on and struggle through myself. But I think being able to identify unhealthy and unhelpful responses to criticism in ourselves and others is a really great first step. But also the first step of many. You can't just stop there, you know? Anyway, not the point. There were also, as I briefly mentioned earlier, a lot of issues in her writing with race and class representations. And I remember as a young kid growing up in a very working class family in the 90s, I never understood how all the kids in the stories had like fancy huge houses or pretty clothes or went to boarding school or were able to have a mum who could stay home with them and didn't have to work. It wasn't relatable for me at all, and that's maybe why I preferred like the stories that had just like pure fantasy elements like fairies and magical lands, because they were unrealistic without needing an explanation. The stuff like how these families with 4 kids could afford like an 8-bedroom mansion in the countryside, I was like, this doesn't make sense in my head. Who can do this? But that one's kind of laughable. But the race issues were far more serious, and they weren't actually all that apparent to me until I got a lot older and realised how bad it was. Partly because by the time I was reading these in the 90s, some of the things had kind of been fixed, if that makes sense. Well, not really, but in some sense, slightly made better-ish, but again, not really. And also, I was from a really small market town in Yorkshire. I didn't understand like the nuances of racial inequality until I became a teenager, you know? So reading these stories as a kid, I didn't realise how bad it was. And this is why pointing out these issues is really, really important, because things like having harmful racial stereotypes in writing can be so insidious because you don't realise they're harmful, and then you internalise them, and then before you know it, you're harming actual people. And that's why this isn't just like, oh, it's just a silly little children's book with some outdated ideas in it. It can be really, really harmful, and it can kind of skew children's views and behaviour growing up, and it's important that we discuss these things and why they're problematic and try and kind of fix them, I guess, and educate people around them. So for one example, do you remember the Noddy story that I mentioned earlier about Noddy being lured into the forest and being mugged? Well, I remember this as a TV episode that was made in, I want to say 1992, definitely the early 90s, and I remember watching that as a kid, and the episode still haunts me because it is terrifying. Noddy is basically lured out to the wood by goblins who then mug him, steal all his clothes, and take his car. Terrifying, horrible, and from then on I was like, oh god, goblins are horrible little creatures. Fairies good, goblins bad. Doesn't seem harmful, they're all fantasy creatures, it's fine, all good. But that's not what it was in the original story written by Enid herself. In the original story, it was Gollies, to shorten the name. She has Noddy, a small white boy, attacked by 3 muggers, essentially in blackface. She's saying these 3 black caricatures mugged a small white boy. Now, the history of these toys themselves is long and complicated and dark, and I won't go too far into it right now, but I'll pop some information on screen if you'd like to pause and have a read about it and understand why these toys in themselves are completely offensive and not okay. And if you would like to find out more, there'll be some sources and further reading material for this and everything mentioned in this video listed down in the video description. So Enid tried to fight criticism to this by saying, no, they're just toys like any other. Does a bear doing something bad make all bears bad? And look, I made them the heroes in this one book. But the fact is, they're not just toys. They are racist caricatures, and when you look at her work as a whole, she does have a pattern of using racially insensitive imagery and harmful stereotypes, especially when portraying villains, and that's a huge, huge, huge issue. She used these literally racist toys with a history of mocking and belittling black people as the villains in a number of stories, and whether intentional or not, she was essentially telling kids, oh, black people are the villains, beware of them, they're gonna mug rich little white boys, and like, that's not okay. That's absolutely not okay. And it is this kind of almost quite subtle but insidious form of racism that does need to be called out and discussed, you know? What's interesting though is that, you know, her her accusations of being racist or being classist, you could say, and stuff like that, they weren't the ones that bothered her the most. The criticism that really, really, really bothered Enid was actually the person or people who suggested that she didn't actually write everything herself. So you know how like James Patterson has this big team of ghostwriters so he can churn out like 10,000 mediocre books a year with like no substance to them, and they're all boring and they have basically the same plot? Some people think Enid Blyton did that, and it offended her so much she took them to court over it. So being called a racist, okay. Being told, hey, did you actually write this stuff yourself? There's a lot of it. She takes them to court. I guess I have to wonder, like, was she most offended by this because there was an ounce of truth to it and she was trying to cover it up, or was it because it was the least true of all and she was genuinely offended because this was her work and she was proud of it? I don't know. It's really hard to say, and again, like with everything in this video, I don't have any solid answers. Anyway, other than the controversies in her writing, I guess the only thing left to talk about is the end of Enid Blyton's life, and even this had some kind of weird stuff going on. So Enid had always been like scared of being ill and illness in general and doctors and stuff, as you might remember from when Hugh got sick with pneumonia earlier in her life. And she was especially scared of having heart problems because that's what killed her father. And one day during a round of golf, Enid just collapsed. She felt breathless and faint, and a doctor was called. And where this gets kind of interesting is that Enid was paranoid she'd had a heart attack. And the doctor checked her over and said, nope, your heart's just fine, just a bit of stress, you're probably overworking. Relax more. But Kenneth and Enid both got it into their head that she'd had a heart attack. Kenneth even went as far as to tell Enid's daughters that this is what it was. He called them up and was like, hey, your mum's had a heart attack. Straight up lie. Who knows why he did this, but it's weird, right? Was he trying to pretend it was more serious than it was, so Enid would actually take the doctor's orders to rest more seriously, or was there something more weird or sinister and kind of gaslighty behind it? I don't know. I just find it very odd. Anyway, even through being kind of ill, Enid kept trying to work over the next few years, but her greatest fear kind of sadly came true, and her mind and memory started to suffer. She struggled to sleep, she became depressed, she was even more irritable than usual, so you can imagine what she was like. And again, during this time, weird stuff kept happening. So when Enid was supposed to be helping her daughter Gillian plan her wedding, at one point she starts to feel a little breathless and needs a rest, and Kenneth decides to phone up Gillian and say, hey, your mum can't come to the wedding, she's had another heart attack. Very odd, but then Enid makes this miraculous recovery 2 days later, and she attends the wedding, and it's all good. Very, very odd, isn't it? I don't understand it. Things started to get more serious in the 60s. Enid was feeling breathless more often. Her memory was really, really failing her by this point. She struggled to concentrate on anything, and she was also getting a little bit delusional. She was struggling to distinguish fantasy from reality and kind of getting her books and stories mixed up with her real life. And like I say, losing control of her own mind had always been her greatest fear, and honestly mine too, so I can understand how scary that was. And around the same time, Kenneth was starting to fall ill himself, and in 1967, sadly he died, and Enid was alone only for another year after that before she also died peacefully in her sleep in November 1968. And that's where the story of Enid Blyton ends, but not the story of her work, because it continues to be published and loved by millions of people today. And although some of it has been cleaned up a little over the years, I basically wanted to make this video to kind of, help you understand the background behind her work, who she was, and also kind of make you question a few of the things you might have been taken for granted in regards to how you feel about the people who create the content you love. Not everyone is as they seem, and this can be a great thing or a dangerous thing. Not everyone is all perfect and good, and that's an absolutely okay human thing to be. I think different parts of people's work can be good and bad, and it's up to you to decide how much of good and bad you're okay with, and which bits you want to consume and which bits you don't, which authors you want to help and which ones you don't. It's a really, really complicated topic. And where do we draw the line when it comes to separating the art and the artist? For example, if you buy Enid Blyton's work today, you're not actually giving any money to Enid Blyton. You're not supporting a racist. You're not supporting kind of a misogynist. You're not supporting this woman who cheated on her husband and this and this and this. You're supporting an innocent family, and I think a lot of it goes to help charities and children who need help too. So is it still okay to buy and consume her media when it's not going to who you may or may not perceive to be a bad person? On the other hand, take someone like J.K. Rowling, who has been disgustingly transphobic and continues to double down on it. And when you do buy any of her media, or even consume it on streaming platforms, for example, when you buy any of her stuff, like if you go out and buy a Harry Potter book, she is getting money from that still. You are giving money to someone who is actively using her platform to push a transphobic rhetoric. So for me, I wouldn't want to give any money to J.K. Rowling because, of her transphobic viewpoints, but I think I'd be okay giving money to Enid Blyton's family, despite her racist past, because they're not the ones who did those things. Does that make sense? And this is where I think we need to kind of draw this line between art and artist, past and present, and look at who benefits, who doesn't, what all these things mean. There's a lot to it, and it is kind of complex, and I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I think everyone will be a little bit different, but this is kind of where I want to end this and pass it over to you guys to discuss down in the comments. But for now, thank you so much for watching today. If you did like this video, please subscribe to my channel for more kind of book reviews, poetry analysis. I do science and history and all kinds of educational content. I do lots of social commentary and talk about feminism and pro-LGBT issues and all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, if you want to stick around here and subscribe, that would be absolutely great. Also, check if you've been unsubscribed, because I know YouTube's been doing that to a few people recently, so just have a little looky, see what's happening there. It would be great if you want to like the video, comment for engagement, and you can also go follow me over on Instagram to see fun things that I post with my little doggo, Kyra, and I talk about clothes and makeup and books and things that interest me and all sorts of fun stuff over there. So you can follow me at Rachel Oates, but the Oates is with a 0 because my actual name was taken and it was really annoying, so I had to improvise. And yeah, that's me done for today, I think. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you guys a lot, and I'll see you again soon.